Hello everybody, it's your favorite Western out in space here, and we've talked a lot about different storytelling aspects on this channel, and I want to keep doing it. However, we need to spice it up. Me just ranting into the void isn't terribly interesting. So instead, today we'll review a Webtoons, because I think it's a fair assessment, and it's free, so we can all do it. Also, this one is like stupidly popular, like 1 million views, I think, so I don't really feel like I'm punching down here. So anyway, the comic in question is Wolfbite, which is supposedly the story of a normal girl in a horrible relationship with an abusive husband, or at least a very neglectful one, and who gets turned to a werewolf, and of course shenanigans ensue. Overall, okay, not a bad premise, not super duper original, but hey, you know, sometimes it's the little things. And honestly, I'm a fan of tropes and cliches, let's just be honest here. However, this Webtoons is a perfect example of several flaws in modern storytelling, or just storytelling in general, so I shall use them as a way to pick apart this example right now. The first one is tension, or the narrative concept of things building up into themselves, or the consequences of things slowly coming unraveled. In this particular case, the comic is a perfect example of failing on this, because there just isn't really any tension in the story. Like, in the opening is a perfect example, where where she sees this whole werewolf in front of her, and her whole stick in this case is that, you know, she doesn't want to live anymore, so she throws herself into the werewolf, hoping it will just finish her off quickly. This, of course, doesn't happen, but that's neither here nor there. There's no tension in this scene properly. Ironically enough, it is one of the most better paced parts of the comic, and it gets even worse a little bit, is that a perfect example is actually the abusive, or at least neglectful husband in the story, who's supposedly, at least according to the description, a big aspect of the story that just doesn't really pan out. Like in most of these kind of stories, you'd expect him to play at least a somewhat major role, at the very least have some narrative significance, but he's just there occasionally, like once or twice, and then she divorces him, and he's out of the story so far, pretty much. And that's just not how this works. It should be a constant, over-looming, present threat, and you should just feel for her and the narrative tension of what could happen, or what's going on, or how this love that was once so good fall apart. And the thing is, the very first real scene we get with him kind of shows how neglectful he is, that he doesn't care, that she, was gone all night, or he doesn't notice that she has a massive scar on her neck. But then it's just not really there. And this is supposed to be a big, intense thing for her as a character, but then it's just not really there, because she just divorces him, pretty much. Just okay, it was that easy. I mean, obviously in the story, I'm getting that it was more hard for her, but it doesn't come off that way in the story. There's no tension there. And another example is the tension that's brought up for 2 issues before it happens, of how the fact is when they both turn to full werewolves, they'll probably try to fight each other due to pack dominance, predator type things. And you know what, that's okay, but it just comes out of nowhere, and only until the very end does any character seem to be taking this somewhat seriously. And it was actually, once again, one of the better written parts of it, when there's a tiny bit of tension of what's going on. But overall, this comic just doesn't have any. There's no tension of what's going to happen, with no suspense, and nothing really to keep you pushing to read. It's not just you can guess what will happen, you pretty much know where it's going from the start, with little to nothing interesting happen, despite a few added elements. Like the vampire, which is another great example, actually. He's really set up, and, well, not really set up very well. He's supposed to go, oh, there's a vampire, but, it doesn't really matter. He's just kind of there. But this is a perfect segue into the next flaw in this comic. The next thing being actual consequence to actions. This is not just characters make a choice and consequences, but rather it's the setup of certain events that aren't properly paid off correctly. And I kind of touched on this a little bit in the tension segment, but these two problems are interlinked. But a great example of this is how very early on, of course, she is bitten in the first/second issue, and then just completely ignores it until way, way later. Well, okay, admittedly, it's not entire issues, but it's dude, when you know something is a werewolf and it bites you, one of the first questions most people would ask is, wait a minute, am I a werewolf now? Not just forget about it. I guess he was trying to go with, oh, she's so obsessed with the shock of things, or her husband, that she doesn't think about it immediately, but it's not really played well. And even when she does learn about it, she's just kind of mildly excited, ish. Like, I feel like in this kind of situation, a character learning they've been turned into a monster of some type, even if it's the kind of monsters that's like, if you bought me using a term from World of Darkness fans, superheroes with furs and fangs, even then there would be some concern, like, dude, it's like superhero origin 101 type thing. Have the character become shocked and amazed or horrified with their new abilities. But she just doesn't do that. It like breaks one of the core tenets of these kind of things. And even with the romance, she's just clear, like there's like 2 or so issues where she kind of questions what's going on, and then just once again ditches the abusive husband, and there's no consequence. It's like, granted, in the real world things are complicated, but in a story, the husband, there should have been some consequence to this, or this should have been really hard for her, and it's just not properly conveyed. And back to the whole, and the vampires, another great example, once again, is how he's set up for a tiny bit that he could be something, and then he's just not. Like, he really doesn't matter. Like, I'm being 100% honest with you. He could just be a guy pretending to be a vampire, or something like that, or just anyone, or just a person, and the story wouldn't change. The consequences of him being a vampire are basically non-existent. But what might be the most, okay, not the most egregious, but certainly a prime example, is the whole setup they had that blah, blah, if they both turn, they might try to fight each other, hurt each other. That just doesn't happen, like, at all. Like barely anything comes of this. It's like, what was the point of this? What was the point of this? Like, really? Like, you think this would be the most basic setup in the world. Okay, there's a fight gonna happen here, and then it just doesn't at all. Not even because the characters were clever and cleverly thought of a way to get around it, but it just doesn't happen. And worst of all, not only does it not happen, nothing interesting replaces it, and the characters barely acknowledge it even supposed to happen. So it's like, if there's no, like, a perfect example of this is how if there's no tension and no consequences, then there's no real story, because nothing effectively happens. And that's kind of a problem if you're trying to write a story. But I don't just want to be super negative in this video and just say something's bad without trying to get some counterpoints. So how would I preferably try to fix a story in this kind of scenario, or at least ways to improve your writing? Well, it's not entirely impossible. Now granted, this will a lot depend on the story, but generally speaking, setting up events and making sure they feel like they have consequences, and then paying off those consequences will help you out greatly. Tension and consequences, my friend, or payoff, depending on how you want to look at that term. Once again, this is like if character sees a big scary monster, you don't generally want to undercut that, unless it's a joke, with the just monster not being anything. If you set up a character's going to go through something traumatic, don't just undercut it generally, ever. Don't set up something as a big important threat and then just not pay it off. These alone can really help a story, as ignoring it can kill a story. Having characters that don't act like they care can kill a story, potentially more than even a bad or inconsistent story. I mean, heck, this chick had like no reaction to almost anything that happened in this comic. I mean, I had more of a reaction when a bunch of scientists kidnapped me and shot me to Mars. But regardless of all that, ultimately though, it's not just strictly okay, it is kind of a bad story, but it's not an awful story. It's not like offensive, if that makes sense. And ultimately, the art style's nice, I gotta give credit to that, you know? But ultimately, it's important to remember these tips of always remember to have good tension in a story and pay it off with proper consequence. And there, it can improve your storytelling greatly. But anyway, do you have any other thoughts on this comic? Do you think I got something wrong, or my thoughts are incorrect? And ultimately, I'll see you all next time. Yeah. Hey, why don't you hit that sub button? You're gonna become a subscribble. Get to see my content quicker. Wouldn't that be nice? I bet so.